Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Lisa Beth Kovitz. In series like X-Men or Jupiter's Legacy, genetically altered superheroes push the limits of human biology to save the world. In Netflix's new series Sweet Tooth, genetically altered kids are immune to a deadly virus. And in his new book, The Next 500 Years, geneticist Christopher E. Mason thinks we should be doing our best right now to alter our biological limits to save our species. But for realsies. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me.
The whole title of Dr. Mason's new book is The Next 500 Years, Engineering Life to Reach New Worlds. And while it's definitely a cutting-edge book about cutting-edge genetics, it's also eminently readable, and you'll feel super smart as you follow along and begin to understand the reasoning behind Dr. Mason's plan to send our species out into our universe, using theories that sound like they're right out of Marvel's universe. So, Chris, what's the 500-year plan?
So this is really a treatise of hope for humanity. It's something I really believe that can happen, should happen, and really hope will happen, but really grounded in what was science fiction 20 years ago, but now has become a real science reality. So it's the technology and tools laid out in about a 10-phase, 500-year plan of how we learn enough about genetics and about engineering cells and genomes, and then apply that to going to the moon, Mars, eventually farther, and at the end of it, going towards an entirely new star.
Genetic change is in the current zeitgeist like the Wild West was in the 1940s. We're awash in movies and TV shows about genetically altered creatures from pigs to dinosaurs to sharks to us. As a species, we're thinking about it. But Chris, it's all fun when it's fiction. In real life, are you experiencing any major hurdles to the acceptance of these ideas?
I think when it becomes recreational, acceptance is mixed, but when it's clinical, acceptance is almost absolute, because if you're facing a cancer that has mutated and evolved in a way that you can't fight with normal drugs, you will engineer T cells to do what's called CAR T therapy. For example, I discuss at length in the book. We've been engineering cells and deploying them here in clinical trials at the hospital. That's, everyone's in favor of genome and cellular engineering when it can cure their cancer. And so I found there's really no resistance there. It's the question of how accurate we can do it, though, in other contexts, and how well we can do it for long-term missions, like, for example, for astronauts. That, as I say in the book, is probably still 10 or 20 years away before we would actually do this for people that would be going to flight. But the technology and the science are already here today. It's just about how we would perfect them and make sure that they're safe and effective.
Okay, so well then let's break it down. In your 500-year plan, where are we right now? What can we do? And if you say that you can make super soldier serum, my sons and I are going to sign up with you right now.
So, Captain America is not my nickname. I have not found the serum yet. It is not. I get out of the shower, I still just look like a dorky professor. So I think that has not happened yet. But it is. I mean, what we found so far is, the therapeutic aspects are already being deployed at our hospital around the world in clinical trials. We're helping. But the things we have already found are ways where you can take genes from, for example, tardigrades, and we can take these little water bears that can survive in the vacuum of space, and they can resist heavy amounts of radiation, far more than any human could. And we've taken those genes and put them into human cells, and we can show that they can have about an 80% reduction in their DNA damage. And so we know we can use the evolutionary lessons of one creature and apply it to human cells and have them resist the radiation, which is one of the biggest hazards of spaceflight. So, and again, this isn't in clinical trials yet, but it just shows that it's definitely possible. It's technically feasible. The cells seem to be okay with it. So radiation resistance is one that we're currently in phase 2 of the 500-year plan. Phase 1 was just mostly discovery for the past 10 years. And so phase 2 is more of that discovery and the beginning to put it into human cells, which is what we're doing in my lab now.
And this is highly reflected in our fictions. In June of this year, the #1 series on Netflix was Sweet Tooth, which was developed by Jim Mickle based on the graphic novel by Jeff Lemire. And in it, a deadly virus has spread across the world with the strange side effect that many humans are born with hybridized animal cells. And in chapter 2 of The Next 500 Years, you write about real-life viral methods for DNA cargo and something called transfection. What is transfection? Transfection, what a great word. And how does it happen?
When we do it for stably transfected human cells, what that means is we've taken a virus that can go into a human cell, integrate into the genome, stay there, and be stable, and carry a genetic payload with it. So and it sounds weird to think, I don't know if I want something to jump into my genome and stay there. except that this does happen in other instances. For example, HIV can do this. It can integrate into the genome. Other viruses that can infect you can stay in your genome. Even the human genome itself, if you think of it as like a 100-page book, about 8 of those pages of our genetic recipe of humans is old viruses, like these old, what are called endogenous retroviruses. So a lot of our genome is kind of this old pressed layers of papers from organisms and viruses and our evolutionary history, all in one big book of life that includes a bunch of old viruses anyway. So even though it sounds weird to be transfecting cells and integrating something into them, this has already happened over hundreds of millions of years, many incountable times, and will continue to happen. So I think what's interesting is before we've been blind to it, we had no idea what was really happening. But now we can sequence the genome, we can exquisitely see what's happening, and then do it more on purpose rather than on accident, I'd say.
What happens in this fantasy sweet tooth, it was accidental, as if the DNA was in the air like wild yeast. Are there accidental DNA particles that can hitch a ride on a virus and change us?
In principle, yes, but generally there's so many defense systems built into human cells that often prevent this, but not always. And so, as I mentioned, HIV is one case where an infectious virus can even get into the human genome. A retrovirus can become RNA into DNA and then stay inside the genome. And how often it happens in nature is still kind of debated, because we've only gotten the ability to sequence, really high quality genomes in the past 10 years to see where are all these viruses integrating, how many are there, can we correctly phase them, which means we place them in the correct context within the genome and see where they came from. We've been blind to it for all of human history, but now we can begin to see where they are. And this is, I think, we'll probably find out it's much more common, I think, than we thought, because we already know just on the estimates of the human genome, about, again, 8% of our DNA is already a bunch of old viruses kind of hanging around.
So in the fantasy sweet tooth, the virus that's altering the human genome is startling. The lead character has grown a nice set of antlers because of it. But ultimately, in the story, that transfection is a good thing. Is it we're talking about HIV, but are there good sides to it also?
It's rare. Well, that's what's described in Sweet Tooth is I don't know of a case where someone got a new superpower from an integrated viral segment, but because normally you're worried about it. I mean, what we do know though is, that's with looking within one person, but if you look across evolution, there are many reports and single analyses of when viruses do integrate into the genome. Even though that sounds bad, what it is it creates a new evolutionary playground. It gives you basically new genetic material to see if it works well. So we've seen this in plants, for example, that can pick up other traits from other organisms. And bacteria, it's very common. The most obvious example is bacteria picking up a resistance to an antibiotic that they're trying to, fight against. So, but that's a much smaller organism. But we know that, that could yet give you antlers. I do talk a bit in the book about getting chloroplasts into human skin and then having a chlorohuman, which would be kind of fun. That has not yet happened by chance, but we know, at least in principle, the mechanisms that would be needed to be present to make it possible.
In the TV show The Expanse, based on a series of novels by the bilateral entity known as James S.A. Corey, writers imagined how the human body might change as it spends more and more time in outer space. But our guest, Dr. Chris Mason, conducted an actual study on astronaut Scott Kelly, who spent 340 days in space while his identical twin, Mark Kelly, remained on Earth. Chris, what are some of the real challenges facing the human body as we venture into space?
We've been looking at the biggest challenges are the ones that deal a lot with sort of the radiation and the loss of a gravitational field. Really, people call it zero gravity, but there's still plenty of gravity. It's just they're all just falling towards Earth at the same speed. So you still have a gravitational field. It's just different on the body. So suddenly, we've obviously evolved to be on Earth at 1G. And suddenly you have liters of fluid that come up into your upper torso, into your head. So astronauts normally get a kind of puffy face, it's called, when they get into space. Eventually it subsides, but it's not pleasant. And that's a short-term change. So we've seen a lot of these changes in fluid shifts, it's called, also cognitive changes. We looked a lot at the molecular changes and looking for things like DNA damage or stress on the body. But there's also psychological stressors on, being alone, being away from Earth and friends, being in a limited resource environment. These are all challenges that we and NASA and other space agencies are all looking at addressing. And what we did observe is everything, almost everything changed in the body when he got to space. So we looked at things at DNA, at the RNA, proteins, small molecules, the microbes in his gut and his skin and his mouth, everything pretty much changed to adapt to space flight. But the vast majority of it came back to normal. So I'd say, for all the genes that change in his cells, over 90% returned back to normal within a few months. But some did stay, perturbed and kind of were still repairing his DNA even 6 months later. And some of his cognitive skills got a little bit slower, but those eventually recovered. So we can see the body really working hard to adapt to kind of the saying, oh crap, I'm in space at a molecular level. But it does a really amazing job. The plasticity of the human body is not to be underestimated. But that being said, we don't know what it's like if you go to 38% gravity on Mars, for example, and stay there for 2 or 3 years. What would that do? We think it won't be as bad as what happens in, effectively, zero gravity, but we just don't know yet.
Another interesting repetition swirling through the current zeitgeist is stories about the children of superheroes. Over on Netflix, the backstory to the series Jupiter's Legacy involves beings from Jupiter granting superpowers to 6 humans in the 1930s. Fast forward to now, and those 6 have passed their superpowers and dysfunctional family dynamics onto their children. All right, so what genes do we have that we might pass down to our children, and what genes are not transferable?
You get half your DNA from your mom and half from your dad. What's interesting in the book I describe is that we know that there's ways now you can actually make germ cells or egg and sperm cells from two female mice, for example, and then create a new embryo, or 2 male mice has been done as well. So there are ways where you think about just getting half from mom and half from dad. It could, in at least relatively soon, pretty likely be half from mom and half from dad and dad. Or in the case of the UK, they've gotten what are called 3-parent embryos, where you have mother, father, and then a mitochondrial donor. So out of the egg, you'll take out all the mitochondria to avoid a mitochondrial disease, and then place a donor in. So you can have basically 3 genetic contributors to the next generation. And so what's interesting is, again, 10, 20 years ago, this hadn't been happening, but now researchers shown it's possible. It's being deployed clinically to avoid a disease. So you can imagine 3-parent babies, and I talk about in the book about, well, what if you could, if it's getting that easy, what if you could have 4 parents contribute a quarter each to a child? It hasn't been done, technically, but conceptually, it's just a slight variation of what's already occurring. And the technology to do it already exists. So it's just really about partitioning and organizing, really the genetic material that you give on. So that is, currently it's a random lottery, but I think in the future, this would lead to a real cellular liberty, where instead of being given a lottery ticket as an embryo and like, here's what you get, it could have one that's a bit better, so it avoids disease that you could avoid, for example, Tay-Sachs disease or mitochondrial disorders. Or maybe even, someday, you have additional features that you'd want, like material from someone else. So I think this is in the early days of being able to do that, but we know it's possible. And also, I think enables more liberty. So instead of being just stuck with something, you can actually have a bit more choice about what you get and what you do with it.
But it does come back to that question of to avoid disease, everybody's on board, but to create superheroes, it becomes
right. Like how do you know? So I think it's going to be, very much like, there were concerns that even IVF, when it started, would lead to massive disease and deformed babies. Many people were against it, including many religions, many scientific leaders. But now we know, decades after, it's actually perfectly safe. And so I think if we get to a point, I think it'll be similar. If someone says, I have a specific gene, let's take DSEP, for example, that gene from tardigrades. I think this will be great. It will be viewed, I think, appropriately with suspicion and caution at first. Like, well, I don't know if that's really a good idea. And you'd have to have a really compelling reason to actually deploy it in an embryo, to modify an embryo to include a given gene. The best example actually would be what He Jiankui did when he CRISPR'd human embryos. And his concept was, well, I'll delete CCR5, this gene that is sort of the portal for how HIV gets into cells. Because his idea was, well, if you have parents that both have had HIV, this gives them a way to have a child that would be guaranteed not to get it, or at least most strains of the virus. And on the surface, it's like, well, that seems like a good idea. But if you don't have that receptor, you're more susceptible to West Nile as a different virus. So like everything in biology, if you gain one thing, you have to ask, well, what else have I lost, or vice versa? And we just don't know it for most things. We haven't even had a whole genome for really more than a couple decades. We don't have a lot of molecular data linked to the sort of clinical records. So we we frankly don't know enough yet to make the case that I could safely give you a superhero gene. But I think eventually we will, because we'll have enough data, we'll have enough trials, and it'll start, I think, like the cancer clinical trials. It'll start because someone has no other choice. So listen, you're facing either imminent death or this new experimental therapy, and then I think they'll try it. And if you do it enough times, you can gauge safety and efficacy.
Okay, so one of the joys of my life is asking smart people stupid questions. And here's my stupid question. So in Jupiter's Legacy, which did not get a second season, so we'll never really know, the original superheroes are tested to make sure they have a moral fiber.
Don't you remember the island and what we had to do to earn these powers?
But the genes that they pass down to their children, the children may not have the moral fiber. And additionally, you're creating a class of superheroes. You're sectioning society even greater if these genetic children, if this genetic line gets more. I mean, it's one thing when you inherit wealth. What happens when you start to inherit superpowers?
Yeah, this is, particularly in the United States, actually, the discrepancy between the wealthy and the poor in terms of access to healthcare, access to resources, just general, lifespan. Of course, they're starkly different. And, the technology, for as much as a scientist, I want to say, well, the technology is one thing and society is a different thing. They are inextricably linked, of course. And so I think I would give almost anything to make it so the technology could be created and then equitably and uniformly distributed. I sort of running for office, I suppose, and changing the entire healthcare system. I don't know how I can do that, but I can keep pushing forward, advocating, talking to politicians, representatives. But there's two challenges. One is the scientific and technical. The other one is social and moral and political, but they're connected. And I don't think there's a gene for morality yet, as much as Galton wanted there to be one. I think the best evidence for this is actually from twin studies, where if you look at which religion do you become if you have twins separated at birth, there's almost no correlation between what your religious choice is and genetics, because it's something that's learned, right? So I think the moral fiber is probably not to be found in our genome. I think maybe some of the instincts are, but I don't think the specific representation is. So I'm not too worried about that. But I am greatly worried, though, about the stratification of society that already exists, that might be exacerbated by new technology that makes it more apparent or even more stark, or some people suddenly live 30 years longer than someone else, or just don't get disease. So this is, you may even argue we shouldn't deploy it until the technology, until we fix society. But I don't know if we should, because who decides when society is perfect? It's probably never going to reach a state where we all think that. Meanwhile, if we have a way to avoid disease and have people live better lives, then I would advocate for that.
In the CW's Superman and Lois, not to be confused with Lois and Clark, Superman, Man of Steel, Smallville, and of course, Mike Myers' 2013 Supermensch. But what makes this 2021 version of Superman's life a little different is that the middle-aged Lois and Clark have twin teenage boys. And Chris, I know it's not real, I know that. But given what you've told me about the complexity of Earthlings of different species swapping genes, what would it take for an alien and a human to produce children? Is that even possible?
It depends. So there is something called hybrid vigor, where two species that even have different numbers of chromosomes can sometimes, make a child, or maybe make a baby. It happens in fruit flies. It happens, you think of like horses and donkeys, for example, and mules. We know it's possible. It's usually rare, as evidenced by, people who, if you can do it in cell culture in a dish, or even if you look in the animal kingdom, it usually doesn't lead to an embryo. But the same way we talked about mitochondrial donors, like if you know which genetic components you need to swap out or improve or change, it's not impossible, especially if we had exquisite control of whole chromosomes that you could move around and modify, which we have some control today, but it's only going to get better. I'm going to say it's today hard, but not necessarily impossible. And I think in the future, it'll be, complex, but manageable of a problem, assuming their DNA even is made of the same material as our DNA, of course. There's a lot of assumptions about all this. But I'm an optimist on the technology because again, we can see it now. If you asked this question 30, 40 years ago, we barely knew what a karyotype was or how to use it diagnostically we didn't know what the genetic code, even what was comprising the human genome or other genomes for that matter. So there was so much we didn't know. It would have been very much a guess. But now we could, break. And we do this a lot with cell lines. You see which piece of a gene is contributing the most towards killing a cell or keeping it alive, or what is contributing to two cells even coming together at all. We can go, section by section and pull out the sections that provide what you want or don't, and then remove them. So it's a solvable challenge, I think, actually, in today's genetics world.
Or maybe just Kryptonians and humans have the same number of chromosomes, or maybe Lois and Clark used IVF. In Superman and Lois, only one of the two fraternal twins inherited Clark's Kryptonian abilities. And on Amazon, in Invincible, human alien teen Mark Grayson inherits none of his mother's earthly genes and is genetically 100% Vitramite. But can a child inherit more or even 100% of his or her genetic code from one parent? And does it all go back to Gregor Mendel and his gardening hobby?
So it's never happened where you get, at least to my knowledge, there's never been a case where someone got all the genetic material from one parent. Or if there's, it's just called a clone, basically. So there is a way to do it. You just clone someone. But being done naturally, that's never occurred. Some things that are kind of like it, though, do occur quite often. So one of them is called non-disjunction, or just really means junction. Two chromosomes stay together. Because if you think about in your own body, you go to make egg or sperm, you take your two copies, you split them in two, and you give one or the other. But what if that splitting doesn't work? And so in one sperm, you might still have two copies instead of one of your DNA. You give that to someone else, suddenly you've got three copies. And that's actually how Down syndrome can happen. We have three copies of chromosome 21 instead of two. In every other chromosome, you have two copies. So that can happen on a chromosome by chromosome basis where you get little bits of it, but it's never happened across all chromosomes. Or if you do, you would just call it a clone. But then also, if you did that, you'd have three copies of every chromosome. You're supposed to only have two, at least in our species. So it would also probably not survive. But we know mechanistically how it can happen and why it would happen, but it probably wouldn't happen in a natural state and survive, I think. But in terms of how it happens genetically, it's very clear, and we see versions of it kind of chromosome by chromosome, I'd say.
The sapien part of Homo sapien refers to the Latin word for wise, and the scientific term for the subspecies of who we are right now is Homo sapien sapien, because humans are just that darn wise. Mm-hmm. But Chris, as we change, will we still be Homo sapien sapiens?
We will inevitably become something a little bit different. And I think this is not something to be feared. It's something to be, welcome. As much as when we progress from being something like a Homo erectus or other versions of Homo species, eventually it's worked out well. And I think if you go far enough in the future, you either have to engineer the genome to stay very much the same, which is one option, or as it continues to evolve and continues to drift, there may become a time where it is actually distinct enough to call it a new species. And normally that's done when you say it can no longer reproduce with the other species. And so it's just a barrier in terms of reproduction. But it could be, if it's on another planet and it's far enough away and it's evolved, you could start to call it something else. So I'm hoping we'll keep the wisdom. Part of that is part of my moral plea in the book, is that we are the only ones that can serve as these really guardians and shepherds for life and complexity in the universe. And I'm hoping that can persist. And if there's a version of humans that doesn't do that, that maybe just, destroys the universe, or just, stares at the ceiling all day, or I'm not sure what it would look like, but I would hope that wouldn't happen. But even there, maybe you could have a temporary treatment that would get you back to the wisdom.
Sometimes science fiction is a rehearsal for science fact, and gigantic interstellar battles over the differences that separate humanoid species is great fodder for great stories. But as a reality, could these heritable genetic scientific changes seed future conflicts? Could they make us too different? And should we also be laying the groundwork now for a way of working together that will someday evolve to be the Federation from Star Trek? And I know it's a bit of an unfair question. You're a doctor, not a social worker. But if our future lies in space, if humans are going to change, how do we lay the groundwork for a harmonious humanoid intergalactic cooperation?
It's a great question. Even though I'm just a simple geneticist, it is a great question because, again, science does not exist in a vacuum. It has to be, and always is, embedded in the society that is creating it and applying it. So I think, actually, one thing about the Expanse, the series, is it's this extraordinary technological feat where humans are now, basically scattered throughout the solar system, people traveling interplanetary trips all the time. It's become this simple rote just expression of moving through the solar system. But even there, after all that technology and time has passed, they're still just as tribal and petty and competitive as they have been, on Earth for millions of years. And so on the one hand, I love the series and the books, and because it was just this beautiful vision of what could come technologically and also the struggle to get there. But then by the time we got there, we just, we're still fighting over everything: resources, allocations, assumptions, versions of racism that are now applied to people that come from different places. So I'm hoping that in the future, it's not quite as bleak. If you look back at human history, we haven't succeeded yet in avoiding war or conflict or pettiness or struggle in some sense. So our track record is 100% bad on avoiding conflict and strife and war. But I'm still an optimist because I think, while we have still had minor wars, if you will, we haven't at least had a world war in a long time. And maybe that'll be a good sign. And of course, there's been, structural inequalities and institutional challenges of deploying resources or discrimination that's still happening all the time. But I think overall it's gotten better, and even life expectancy has gotten better, literacy has gotten better, the quality of life by every quantifiable metric has gotten better. So I think, we're still on the right path towards hopefully avoiding this interplanetary warfare. But so far, our track record is 0% on accomplishing that. So I'm maybe an outlier in my optimism here.